I never thought a muddy creek behind my house would become the epicenter of a legal nightmare that would ultimately destroy my neighbor's property. But when Brenda Whitmore decided she wanted a private beach in suburban Colorado, reality stopped mattering to her. My name is Graham Morrison, and I had been living peacefully in Riverside Heights, a planned community just outside Boulder, for 3 years before everything went sideways. The house was perfect for me, a 38-year-old software developer who worked from home and appreciated the quiet. The backyard had a gentle slope down to Willow Creek, a modest waterway that ran through our neighborhood carrying snowmelt from the mountains during spring and maintaining a steady flow the rest of the year. It was maybe 15 feet wide at most points, shallow enough to wade across in summer, and bordered by natural vegetation that prevented erosion. I loved sitting on my back deck in the evenings, listening to the water burble past. Brenda Whitmore was the vice president of the Riverside Heights HOA, a position she wielded like a medieval warlord brandishing a sword. She was 52 years old, had perfectly highlighted blonde hair that never moved in the wind, and wore athleisure outfits that cost more than my monthly car payment. Her house sat on a premium corner lot about 200 yards upstream from mine, also backing onto Willow Creek. She had moved in about 8 months after I did, and within weeks, she had positioned herself as the HOA's enforcement arm. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in late April when I was making coffee and heard machinery running somewhere nearby. The sound was distinctive, a diesel engine and the beeping of something backing up. I walked out onto my deck with my mug and looked downstream, then upstream. The noise was definitely coming from Brenda's direction. I figured she was doing some landscaping work. Her husband, a quiet man named Richard who seemed perpetually exhausted, had mentioned something about a patio project at the last HOA meeting. I went back inside and tried to focus on work, debugging a particularly stubborn piece of code for a client. By lunchtime, the machinery noise had intensified. Now it sounded like multiple pieces of equipment. I went outside again and noticed something that made my stomach drop. The creek looked different. The water level seemed lower and the flow had changed. Instead of the usual steady current, it was moving faster, channeled into a narrower stream. I grabbed my jacket and walked along the creek bank upstream toward Brenda's property. The closer I got, the more my confusion turned to disbelief. When I reached the property line where Brenda's lot began, I stopped and stared. They had brought in sandbags, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. A small excavator was still working, and 2 men in work clothes were stacking industrial-grade sandbags in a massive formation that jutted out into the creek from Brenda's side. The structure created an artificial peninsula that redirected the creek's flow toward the opposite bank, and created a calm, shallow pool on Brenda's side. Behind the sandbag wall, they had dumped what looked like several truckloads of sand, creating an actual beach area complete with the beginnings of a decorative stone border. Brenda herself stood near her deck, directing the workers with animated hand gestures. She wore white capri pants and a turquoise blouse, completely impractical for a construction site. "Brenda," I called out, climbing over the low split-rail fence that marked our property boundaries. "What's going on here?" She turned and her expression immediately soured, as if I had just tracked mud across her white carpet. "Graham, this doesn't concern you. I'm making improvements to my property." "You're damming up the creek," I said, gesturing at the sandbag structure. "That's not your property." "The creek belongs to the county, and there are regulations about this kind of thing." "I'm not damming anything," she said with exaggerated patience, like she was explaining something to a particularly dim child. "I'm creating a water feature. The creek still flows, as you can clearly see. I checked with the HOA, and there's nothing in our covenants that prohibits waterfront improvements. The HOA doesn't own the creek either, I pointed out. You need permits from the county for this. You're redirecting a natural waterway. Her eyes narrowed. I don't need you telling me what I can and cannot do with my property, Graham. Perhaps you should focus on getting your lawn edging done properly. I noticed it's been looking sloppy lately. That was classic Brenda, deflecting criticism by pointing out minor violations. My lawn edging was fine. This isn't about lawn edging, I said, trying to keep my voice level. This is about you potentially causing problems for everyone downstream. When you redirect water flow like this, it can cause flooding or erosion elsewhere. The HOA has approved my project, she repeated, crossing her arms. If you have concerns, take them up with the board. You are the board, I said. You and your friends. She smiled thinly. Then I guess you're out of luck. Now please leave my property. You're trespassing. I wanted to argue more, but the two workers had stopped and were watching us. The last thing I needed was a physical confrontation. I turned and walked back to my house, my mind racing through options. The Riverside Heights HOA board consisted of 5 members. Brenda was vice president. The president was a woman named Patricia Dunn, who was basically Brenda's best friend and rubber stamp. The secretary was a retired accountant named Harold Chen, who seemed reasonable but rarely opposed Brenda on anything. The treasurer was Marcus Webb, who only cared about keeping the budget balanced and avoiding special assessments. The 5th member was Jenny Rodriguez, a working mom who barely had time to attend meetings. In other words, Brenda effectively controlled the board. I spent the afternoon researching Colorado water law and creek regulations. What I found was complicated. In Colorado, water rights were a serious matter, governed by a complex system of prior appropriation. Natural watercourses were generally protected, and modifying them typically required permits from multiple agencies, including Boulder County, and potentially the Colorado Division of Water Resources. Placing fill material or structures in a creek definitely seemed like something that would need approval. I called Boulder County's Land Use Department and explained the situation. The woman who answered listened patiently and then transferred me to someone in the engineering division. That person, a man named David, told me that any work within a creek or stream that affected flow patterns would indeed require a floodplain development permit at minimum, and possibly additional permits depending on the scope. How do I report unpermitted work? I asked. You can file a complaint with our Code Enforcement Division, David said. They'll send an inspector out to assess the situation. If violations are found, they'll issue a notice to cease work and potentially require restoration. I filed the complaint online that same afternoon, including photos I had taken of Brenda's construction project. The county website said inspections typically occurred within 5 business days. That evening, I walked down to the creek behind my house again. The change in water level was definitely noticeable. Where the creek normally spread across a wide, shallow bed near my property, it was now concentrated in a deeper, faster channel pushed toward the far bank. The natural vegetation on my side was already starting to dry out from lack of water. I had native plants back there, columbines and wild irises that depended on the creek's presence. More concerning was what I noticed at the downstream property line. My neighbor on that side was an elderly man named Frank Delac, who kept to himself. His yard also sloped down to the creek, and I could see that the accelerated flow was starting to undercut his bank. A small section had already collapsed, leaving an exposed root system from a cottonwood tree. I knocked on Frank's door. It took a few minutes, but he eventually answered, leaning on a cane. "Graham," he said, "what can I do for you?" "Have you noticed the creek looks different?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "I was down there this morning. Something's changed. The water's running faster, eating away at my bank." I explained what Brenda had done upstream. Frank's expression grew grim. "That woman," he muttered. "She's going to cause real problems. You know, the creek flooded about 10 years ago before you moved in. Heavy spring runoff came down from the mountains and several properties got water damage. That's why most of us keep the natural vegetation in place. It slows the water down. She's removed all the vegetation on her section and narrowed the channel," I said. "If we get heavy runoff this year, that water is going to come down here like a fire hose." "Have you reported it?" Frank asked. "Filed a complaint with the county today. They're supposed to send an inspector." "Good," he said. "Let me know if you need me to file one too. I've got photos of my eroding bank." Over the next 3 days, Brenda's workers completed their beach project. The sandbag structure was massive, extending about 12 feet into the creek and stretching for nearly 40 feet along her property line. The sand they had dumped behind it created an actual beach area, complete with lounge chairs and a decorative umbrella. She had even installed what looked like tiki torches along the perimeter. It would have been impressive if it was not completely insane and probably illegal. The creek now ran in a narrow, deep channel on the far side, moving twice as fast as before. The calm pool on Brenda's side looked like a resort feature. I had to admit, from a purely aesthetic standpoint, she had created something that looked nice. But the downstream effects were getting worse. Frank's bank erosion had accelerated, and I noticed my own creek bank was starting to show stress where the redirected current hit it. On Friday, I got a notice in my mailbox from the HOA. It was one of Brenda's special enforcement letters, printed on official letterhead. "Dear homeowner," it began. "It has come to the attention of the board that your property is not in compliance with Section 7.3 of the Riverside Heights Covenants regarding yard maintenance. Specifically, the creek bank area of your lot shows evidence of erosion and dying vegetation, which negatively impacts the aesthetic standards of our community. You have 30 days to remediate this issue or face fines of $50 per day. Sincerely, Brenda Whitmore, Vice President." I stared at the letter in disbelief. She was fining me for the damage her own construction project had caused. The dying vegetation was because she had redirected the water away from my bank. The erosion was because of the increased flow velocity. I immediately drafted a response, keeping it as professional as possible despite my anger. I explained that the issues cited were directly caused by unpermitted modifications to the creek on her property, and that I had filed a complaint with Boulder County. I hand-delivered it to her mailbox and sent a copy to all the other board members. The county inspector came out on Monday. I happened to be in my backyard when a Boulder County truck pulled up to Brenda's house. A man in a county polo shirt got out with a clipboard and camera. I walked over, staying on the public easement path that ran along the creek. "Excuse me," I called. "Are you here about the creek modification?" He looked up. "I'm investigating a complaint, yes. Are you the complainant?" "I am, Graham Morrison. I live right downstream." I pointed at my house. "Jack Sullivan, Code Enforcement," he said, shaking my hand. "This is quite a structure she's built here." "She calls it a beach area," I said. "Started construction last Tuesday. No permits posted, and it's caused erosion and vegetation problems downstream already." Jack walked along the sandbag wall, taking photos and making notes. Brenda came out of her house, moving fast across her lawn. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "This is private property. What are you doing?" Jack showed her his county ID. I'm Inspector Sullivan with Boulder County Code Enforcement. I'm investigating a complaint regarding unpermitted work in Willow Creek. I don't need a permit, Brenda said. This is my property, and I consulted with the HOA. The HOA doesn't have jurisdiction over county waterways, Jack said calmly. Any structure or fill placed in a creek or stream requires a floodplain development permit at minimum. Do you have any permits for this work? I don't need one, she insisted. I'm not blocking the creek. It still flows, see? She gestured at the water running past in its narrow channel. Madam, you've placed significant fill material within the creek bed and constructed a structure that alters the natural flow pattern, Jack said. This definitely requires permitting. I'm going to need to issue a stop work order immediately. The work is already done, Brenda said. And I'm not removing it. I spent $12,000 on this beach area. Jack made a note on his clipboard. You'll be receiving a formal notice of violation within a few days. It will outline the requirements for either obtaining after-the-fact permits, which may not be possible given the scope of work, or restoring the creek to its natural condition. Brenda's face was turning red. This is harassment. I'm being targeted because of a petty neighbor dispute. This is standard code enforcement based on a valid complaint, Jack said. I recommend you consult with an attorney and a civil engineer if you want to pursue permits, but I should warn you that the county typically doesn't approve this type of significant creek modification in residential areas. He handed her a preliminary stop work notice and gave me a card. Document any further damage to your property, he told me. You may need it for civil proceedings. After Jack left, Brenda stormed over to where I stood. You did this, she hissed. You called the county on me. You built an illegal dam and caused damage to my property, I said. What did you think would happen? I'm going to make your life miserable, she said. Every single covenant violation, every little thing you do wrong, I'm going to be on you like white on rice. You want to play games? Fine. Let's play. She turned and stalked back to her house. I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach. I had lived in HOAs before and knew that a vindictive board member could indeed make life difficult. But I was also not about to let her destroy a natural waterway just to have a vanity beach project. The formal notice of violation arrived at Brenda's house 3 days later. I knew this because she immediately called an emergency HOA board meeting, and as a homeowner, I received the email notification. The meeting was scheduled for that Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. I showed up 15 minutes early. The clubhouse was a modest building with a meeting room, kitchen, and small gym. About a dozen other homeowners trickled in, which was a better turnout than usual. Word had apparently spread about Brenda's Creek project. The board members sat at a table at the front. Brenda wore a blazer over her usual expensive casual wear, looking like she was about to chair a corporate meeting. Patricia Dunn, the president, called the meeting to order. Thank you all for coming, Patricia said. We have an urgent matter to discuss tonight. Our vice president, Brenda Whitmore, has been subjected to harassment by the county in the form of spurious code enforcement action. This affects all of us because it sets a precedent for government overreach into our private community. I raised my hand. Point of order. This isn't about government overreach. This is about illegal modification of a county waterway. Brenda shot me a venomous look. The complainant in question is Graham Morrison, who has a personal vendetta against improvements to my property. I have a problem with you damming up the creek and causing damage to downstream properties, I said. Frank Delacroix is here, and he can tell you about the erosion on his property. Frank, sitting 2 rows behind me, raised his hand. It's true. My creek bank is washing away because of the increased water velocity. I've lived here 20 years, and this is the first time I've had this problem. Several other homeowners started murmuring. A woman I recognized from the neighborhood but didn't know well spoke up. "I'm Sandra Yates. I live on Maple Drive. I'm concerned about this because we're heading into spring runoff season. If the creek is channeled differently, could it cause flooding?" "There's no flooding risk," Brenda said quickly. "The creek flows just fine." "This is all exaggeration from Graham because he's mad that I cited him for covenant violations." "You cited me for damage your construction caused," I shot back. Patricia banged a gavel. "Let's keep this civil." "The board has discussed this matter, and we support Brenda's right to improve her property. The county's interference is unwarranted." "The county has jurisdiction over waterways," I said. "The HOA doesn't get to override state and county law." Harold Chen, the secretary, cleared his throat. "I actually looked into this, and Graham is correct. Colorado has very specific laws about water rights and creek modifications. The HOA covenants don't supersede those laws." Brenda turned to glare at Harold. "We approved this project. Are you changing your vote now?" "I don't think we properly understood what we were approving," Harold said carefully. "I thought this was just a landscaping project. If county permits are required and weren't obtained, that's a legal issue." "Whose side are you on?" Brenda demanded. "I'm on the side of following the law," Harold said, showing more backbone than I had expected. The meeting devolved into argument. Several homeowners supported me and Frank, concerned about flooding and erosion. A few supported Brenda, mainly people who were her friends. Marcus Webb, the treasurer, mostly worried about whether the HOA could be held liable for approving an illegal project. Jenny Rodriguez stayed quiet, looking overwhelmed. Finally, Patricia adjourned the meeting without any real resolution, stating that the board would continue to monitor the situation. As people filed out, several homeowners approached me to offer support. Sandra Yates, who had asked about flooding, handed me her card. "I'm an attorney, actually, though real estate isn't my specialty. But if you need advice on dealing with the HOA or county process, I can point you in the right direction." "Thank you," I said. "I'm just hoping Brenda agrees to restore the creek properly." Sandra laughed without humor. "I've dealt with Brenda on HOA matters before. She doesn't back down. This is going to get worse before it gets better." She was right. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 3 more covenant violation notices from Brenda. One claimed my house needed repainting because the trim color was faded. It was not. One said my garbage cans were visible from the street. They were in my side yard behind a fence, exactly where the covenants allowed. One said I had parked my car on the street overnight in violation of parking rules, even though I had parked in my driveway, and the car she photographed as evidence was not even mine. I responded to each notice with detailed rebuttals and my own photos. It was exhausting and stressful. I was trying to work and handle client projects while dealing with Brenda's harassment campaign. Meanwhile, Brenda did not comply with the county's notice of violation. The deadline for response came and went. Jack Sullivan, the code enforcement inspector, came back out to document her non-compliance and told me the county was preparing a formal enforcement order that would include daily fines. Then the weather changed. In mid-May, a weather system moved into Colorado, bringing heavy rain to the mountains. The news warned of potential flooding in areas with high snowpack and significant runoff. Willow Creek began to swell. I watched nervously as the water level rose. On a normal spring, the creek could handle the runoff reasonably well. It would rise and flow faster, but the wide, shallow bed and natural vegetation absorbed and slowed the water. But now, with Brenda's sandbag structure channeling everything into a narrow chute, the water came down like a rapids ride. The creek rose 3 feet in 2 days. The flow on my property became a torrent, tearing at the banks. I put out sandbags near my fence line to prevent undercutting. Frank called to tell me he had water in his basement because the erosion on his property had created a channel that directed overflow toward his foundation. On the third day of heavy runoff, I was working from home when I heard a loud crash from upstream. It sounded like something large had broken. I ran outside and down to the creek. Water was everywhere, but it was not flowing in the creek bed anymore. Or rather, it was not just flowing in the creek bed. I ran upstream toward Brenda's property, my boots squelching in the saturated ground. What I saw made me stop in my tracks. The sandbag structure had failed, catastrophically. The force of the swollen creek had undermined the sandbags from below and blown out a section of the wall. Water was pouring through the gap, but instead of flowing back into the natural creek bed, it was spreading across Brenda's yard in a massive flood. The carefully constructed beach area was gone, washed away. The sand had become a muddy slurry. But worse, much worse, the redirected water was now flowing directly toward Brenda's house and her wooden privacy fence. The fence did not stand a chance. As I watched, a 20-foot section simply collapsed under the water pressure, the posts snapping like toothpicks. Water surged into the neighboring property behind Brenda's house, a lot owned by a couple I had met a few times, the Harrises. I called 911. "This is Graham Morrison at 847 Creekview Drive in Riverside Heights. There's major flooding from Willow Creek. A structure failed and water is flowing into residential properties. We need help." The dispatcher assured me that emergency services were on the way and advised me to stay clear of the floodwater. I called Frank. "Are you okay? The flooding is going to get worse before it gets better." "I'm all right," he said. "I'm upstairs." "How bad is it?" Brenda's sandbag wall failed. "Her whole yard is flooding and her fence is gone. Water is going into the Harris property." "Good Lord," Frank said. "I hate to say anyone deserves it, but she was warned." Fire trucks and a sheriff's deputy arrived within 20 minutes. Firefighters in water rescue gear assessed the situation. The fire chief, a woman named Torres, took one look at the failed sandbag structure and shook her head. "Who built that?" she asked me. "Brenda Whitmore, the owner of this property," I said, pointing at Brenda's house. "She did it without permits about 3 weeks ago." Boulder County issued a violation notice, but she refused to remove it. "It created a dam effect," Chief Torres said. "When the high water came, it overtopped and blew out. Now all that water is going where it shouldn't. We need to get it back into the natural creek bed." The firefighters began working to redirect the flow using portable barriers and channel boards. It was hard, muddy, dangerous work. The sheriff's deputy, whose name was Campbell, knocked on Brenda's door. She came out looking distraught, her perfect hair actually disheveled for once. "My yard," she said, "my fence, everything is destroyed." "Madam, I need to ask you some questions about this structure," Deputy Campbell said, gesturing at the collapsed sandbag wall. "I built a beach area," Brenda said. "It's my property. Did you have permits for this construction?" The deputy asked. "I didn't need permits," she said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Boulder County sent you a notice of violation and ordered you to remove this structure or obtain permits," the deputy said. He had apparently been briefed. "You didn't comply. Now your unpermitted structure has failed and caused flooding that's damaged multiple properties. That's criminal negligence at minimum." "I'm the victim here," Brenda protested. "My property is destroyed." "Your property is destroyed because you built something dangerous and illegal," the deputy said. "Other people's properties are also damaged because of your actions. I need you to stay available. There may be charges filed." The Harrises, whose property had been flooded when Brenda's fence collapsed, came out of their house. Ellen Harris was in tears. "Our basement is full of water," she said to the deputy. "Our furnace is ruined, all our storage, everything." "We'll need you to document everything for a report," Deputy Campbell said. Frank came walking up the creek path, leaning heavily on his cane. "My foundation has water damage," he told the deputy. "And my bank erosion is severe, all because of that dam beach project." Over the next 3 hours, firefighters managed to redirect most of the water back into something approximating the natural creek channel. They used heavy equipment borrowed from the county to break apart what remained of Brenda's sandbag structure and push it out of the creek. Her beach was obliterated, just a muddy scar across her yard. Chief Torres approached me as the emergency crews were packing up. "You're the one who filed the initial complaint with the county, right?" "I am," I said. "You probably saved lives," she told me. "If that structure had been bigger or failed differently, we could have had water hitting houses directly. As it is, we've got property damage but no injuries." "What happens now?" I asked. "The county will have to do a full assessment. There'll be restoration requirements. And based on what I've seen, I'd expect criminal charges. When someone ignores government orders and causes this kind of damage, the DA tends to take it seriously." I went home exhausted, covered in mud, and called my mom in Kansas to decompress. She listened as I explained the whole situation. "Honey, this woman sounds awful," she said. "But are you safe? You need to stay somewhere else while they fix the creek." "I'm okay, Mom," I assured her. "My house is fine. It's Brenda's property and the downstream neighbors who got hit hard." "Well, I hope she learns her lesson," my mom said. "Some people think rules don't apply to them." The next morning, I woke to find news vans in the neighborhood. Apparently, the flooding had made the local news. A reporter from a Boulder station was doing a stand-up in front of Brenda's destroyed yard. I stayed inside, not wanting to get involved with media attention. Boulder County moved fast. Within a week, they had issued a formal enforcement order requiring Brenda to fully restore the creek to its natural condition, remove all fill material and structures, and implement erosion control measures. The estimated cost was $30,000. Additionally, they imposed fines of $5,000 for the permit violation and failure to comply with the original notice. But the county action was just the beginning. Ellen and Mike Harris filed a lawsuit against Brenda for the flooding damage to their property, seeking $20,000. Frank filed a claim for his foundation repairs and bank erosion, another $15,000. I filed my own claim for $5,000 to cover my erosion control costs, damage to my natural landscaping, and legal fees. Then the Boulder County District Attorney got involved. In late May, criminal charges were filed against Brenda Whitmore for reckless endangerment and criminal mischief. The DA's office issued a statement saying that willfully ignoring government safety orders that resulted in property damage warranted prosecution. I was called to give a deposition for the criminal case. The assistant district attorney, a sharp woman in her 40s named Rebecca Ortiz, asked me detailed questions about the timeline of events. "Why did you initially file the complaint with the county?" she asked. "Because I knew modifying a creek without permits was dangerous and likely illegal," I said. "I was concerned about erosion and flooding, which is exactly what happened." "Did Miss Whitmore ever indicate she understood the risks?" "I told her directly that redirecting the creek could cause problems downstream," I said. "She dismissed my concerns and said the HOA had approved it, as if that mattered for county regulations." "After the county issued the violation notice, did she say anything to you?" She threatened to make my life miserable through HOA enforcement, I said. She followed through by sending me multiple frivolous violation notices for things that weren't actually violations. Rebecca made notes. That could support a harassment charge as well, though we're focusing on the primary offenses. The criminal case moved slowly through the system. Brenda hired an expensive attorney who tried to argue that she had relied on HOA approval and didn't understand the permit requirements. The problem with that defense was the documented evidence that the county had explicitly told her she needed permits and ordered her to cease work, which she ignored. In July. After plea negotiations failed, the case went to trial. It lasted 3 days. I testified, as did Frank, the Harrises, Jack Sullivan from Code Enforcement, Chief Torres from the Fire Department, and a hydrologist expert who explained how Brenda's structure had created a dangerous situation that inevitably led to failure during high water. Brenda's attorney argued that she was a victim of overzealous government regulation, and that the flooding was an act of nature, not her fault. The jury did not buy it. After 4 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on both reckless endangerment and criminal mischief. The judge sentenced her to 6 months in county jail, suspended pending 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and restitution to cover all damages and county costs. The total restitution amount came to $78,000. Sitting in the courtroom when the sentence was read, I felt a complicated mix of emotions. I did not enjoy seeing anyone face criminal consequences, but Brenda had been so willfully negligent, so convinced that rules did not apply to her, that this outcome felt necessary. After the criminal case concluded, the civil cases proceeded quickly. Faced with her criminal conviction, Brenda's attorney advised her to settle. The Harrises got their $20,000. Frank got his $15,000. I settled for $4,000, less than I had asked, but enough to cover my actual costs. The creek restoration took most of the summer. Boulder County oversaw the work, hiring contractors who carefully rebuilt the natural creek bed, replanted native vegetation, and installed proper erosion control measures. They removed every trace of Brenda's beach project. By September, Willow Creek looked like it had before Brenda's interference, flowing in its natural wide, shallow pattern. The HOA went through its own reckoning. Harold Chen, showing surprising initiative, called for a special election to recall Brenda from the board. With her criminal conviction, there was overwhelming support. She was removed as vice president. Patricia Dunn, facing criticism for supporting Brenda's project, resigned as president. New elections brought in a more reasonable board, including Sandra Yates, the attorney who had offered me support. Brenda's husband, Richard, filed for divorce in August. I heard through neighborhood gossip that he had been mortified by the whole situation and could not forgive her for the financial and legal disaster she had created. He moved out, and the house went up for sale. I ran into Richard one afternoon at the grocery store. He looked worn out but also somehow lighter, like a weight had been lifted. "Graham," he said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't," I said. "None of this was your fault." "I should have stopped her," he said. "I knew the beach project was crazy, but I never stood up to her about anything. She just steamrolled over everyone, including me." "I hope things get better for you," I said sincerely. "They already are," he said with a slight smile. "I'm renting a condo in town. It's small, but it's peaceful. No HOA drama." Brenda completed her community service hours working for a county parks department cleanup crew, picking up trash and clearing trails. I saw her once during that period, when I was hiking with a friend at a park near Boulder. She wore an orange safety vest and was using a grabber tool to pick up litter. When she saw me, she looked away quickly, her face flushed with embarrassment or anger or both. I did not speak to her. There was nothing left to say. She had learned, in the most expensive and humiliating way possible, that rules existed for reasons, and that nature did not care about HOA politics or personal desires. The house sold in October to a young family with 2 kids. They seemed nice. I introduced myself and made sure to point out the creek's history, wanting them to understand the importance of leaving it alone. The husband, whose name was Tom, laughed and said they had no plans to modify anything. "We read about what happened here," he said. "The whole neighborhood knows the story. We just want to enjoy the water view, not try to change it." That November, I attended the annual HOA meeting under the new board leadership. Sandra Yates, now serving as president, opened with a statement about transparency and following proper procedures. The board had drafted new guidelines requiring any major property modifications to be reviewed not just for covenant compliance, but for legal and safety issues. They had also established a consulting relationship with a local civil engineer who could advise on projects involving water features or significant landscaping changes. "We learned some hard lessons this year," Sandra said. "Our job is to maintain property values and community standards, but that has to happen within the framework of local, county, and state law. Personal preferences don't override public safety." There was applause. The neighborhood had been through a collective trauma with the flooding and legal drama, and people were ready for boring, responsible governance. Frank Delac stood up during the open comment period. "I want to thank Graham Morrison for taking action when he saw something dangerous happening," he said. "A lot of people would have just minded their own business. He likely prevented worse damage and maybe injuries." More applause. I felt my face get hot with embarrassment but also appreciation. It had been a stressful year, but at least it ended with some vindication. Winter came, and Willow Creek froze in the cold months, a sheet of ice winding through the neighborhood. I worked on my projects, took walks in the snow, and enjoyed the quiet I had initially moved to Riverside Heights to find. In February, I received a check in the mail from Brenda's attorney. It was the final restitution payment for my settlement. Attached was a brief letter stating that the matter was now closed. No personal note from Brenda, no apology. I had not expected one. I used part of the money to hire a landscaping company to restore the native plants along my creek bank that had been damaged during the flooding. They did beautiful work, planting columbines, wild irises, native grasses, and shrubs that would stabilize the bank and provide habitat for birds and insects. By spring, my section of the creek would look better than it had before the whole nightmare started. One evening in late March, as the weather warmed and the creek began to flow with early snowmelt, I sat on my back deck with a beer and watched the water. It moved gently, spreading across the natural bed, making its peaceful bubbling sounds. The repaired banks were stable. The vegetation was beginning to green up. Everything was as it should be. My phone buzzed with an email from Sandra Yates. The HOA newsletter. I skimmed it, reading updates about neighborhood events, reminders about spring cleanup, and a notice about the annual community barbecue. Normal stuff. Boring stuff. Exactly what I wanted from an HOA. At the bottom was a small note that made me smile. Reminder to all homeowners. Any projects involving Willow Creek or other common natural features must be approved by Boulder County before beginning work. Please contact the board if you have questions. Let's keep our neighborhood safe and beautiful. I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The construction noise that first Tuesday morning felt like ancient history now. So much drama, so much stress, so many legal proceedings and damaged relationships. All because one person decided that what she wanted was more important than laws, safety, or her neighbor's well-being. Brenda's beach had lasted less than a month before the creek destroyed it and took out her fence in the process. Nature had delivered its own verdict, more decisive than any jury. You could not control a natural waterway with sandbags and entitlement. Physics and hydrology did not care about HOA politics. I finished my beer and went inside to make dinner. Life in Riverside Heights had returned to peaceful normalcy. The creek flowed where it was meant to flow. The HOA was run by reasonable people who followed rules. My property was restored and beautiful. Sometimes I wondered if Brenda ever thought about that beach she had wanted so badly. If she ever regretted the choices she made, or if she still believed she had been in the right and simply been persecuted by bureaucracy and difficult neighbors. I would never know. She was gone, moved on to some other place where hopefully she would think twice before ignoring safety regulations and other people's warnings. Frank stopped by one afternoon in early April. Spring was in full bloom and the creek was running high but controlled, spread across its natural bed exactly as it should be. "Looks good," Frank said, admiring the restored landscaping. "You can't even tell there was all that damage." "Nature recovers if you let it," I said. "Unlike some people," Frank said with a wry smile. We stood together watching the water flow. The creek had been there long before any of us built houses along its banks, and it would be there long after we were gone. It followed its own rules, carved its own path, and could not be controlled or redirected without consequences. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't reported the construction?" Frank asked. "All the time," I admitted. If the sandbag wall had been bigger or failed differently, we could have had houses flooded. People could have been hurt. Kids play in this neighborhood. "You did the right thing," Frank said, "even though it made your life harder for a while. That was the thing about doing the right thing. It was not always easy or comfortable. It often made you unpopular with people who benefited from breaking rules. But in the end, safety and community well-being had to come before individual vanity projects. I thought about that sometimes when I sat on my deck in the evenings. The sound of the creek, the sight of the water flowing in its natural pattern, the wildlife that returned to the restored banks, all of it was worth the stress and conflict of the previous year. The neighborhood was safer because someone had stood up and said no when Brenda Whitmore decided her desire for a backyard beach trumped common sense and the law. The Riverside Heights HOA became something of a cautionary tale in local governance circles. Sandra Yates told me that she had been contacted by several other HOAs in the region asking for advice on how to handle situations where homeowners wanted to do major modifications. Our neighborhood's expensive, dramatic lesson served as a warning to others about the importance of following proper procedures and respecting natural features. The new family in Brenda's old house settled in nicely. Their kids played in the yard, and sometimes I would see them watching the creek with fascination, throwing sticks in and running along the bank to see where they came out. Normal kid stuff. Harmless interaction with nature. The parents kept a close eye on them and had clearly taught them to respect the water. One Saturday morning in May, about a year after the flooding, the dad, Tom, came over with a 6-pack of craft beer. "I wanted to say thank you properly," he said. "We love the house, and I read the full court documents about what happened. You saved this neighborhood from a disaster." "I just filed a complaint," I said, though I appreciated the gesture. "You did more than that," Tom said. You stood up to someone who was used to getting her way, and you protected the environment and public safety. That takes guts. We sat on my deck and drank beer, watching his kids play in the yard next door. Life was good. The neighborhood was healthy. The creek flowed as it should. Later that month, I attended a county meeting about watershed management. I had gotten interested in the topic after everything that happened. The meeting discussed long-term planning for creek and river health in Boulder County, including protections for natural waterways and enforcement of existing regulations. During the public comment period, I stood up and shared my story. I explained what had happened in Riverside Heights, how one person's illegal modification had caused cascading problems, and how important county enforcement had been in resolving the situation. "I'm just a software developer," I said. "I'm not an expert in hydrology or environmental law." But even I could see that what my neighbor was doing was dangerous. The county inspectors and prosecutors took the threat seriously and acted appropriately. I hope Boulder County continues to prioritize protecting our waterways. Several county officials thanked me after the meeting. One of them, a watershed manager named Dr. Patricia Gomez, asked if I would be willing to share my story with other community groups as an example of why these regulations mattered. "People think permits are just bureaucratic red tape," she said. "They don't understand that they exist to prevent exactly what happened in your neighborhood. Having a real example with real consequences is powerful." I agreed, and over the following months I spoke at a couple of community meetings and even did a presentation for a group of civil engineering students at CU Boulder. I was not comfortable with public speaking, but I felt like the story needed to be told. If it prevented even one other person from making Brenda's mistakes, it was worth the discomfort. The local newspaper did a feature article about the case in June, focusing on the intersection of HOA authority, environmental regulation, and property rights. They interviewed me, Frank, the Harrises county officials, and even managed to get a brief, terse quote from Brenda's former attorney. Brenda herself declined to comment. The article was balanced and informative, explaining the legal framework that governed creek modifications and the potential consequences when people ignored those rules. It included photos of the destroyed beach area and the restored creek. The contrast was striking. My mom called after the article came out. "I read it online," she said. "I'm proud of you, honey. You really made a difference." "Thanks, Mom," I said, though I would have preferred not to have to deal with any of it. "The best people are often the ones who step up when they didn't want to," she said. "That's what makes it meaningful." Summer turned to fall again, and I marked the 1-year anniversary of Brenda's conviction. The creek continued to flow peacefully. The neighborhood had moved on, focused on normal concerns like school schedules and holiday planning rather than legal drama and flooding. The HOA board under Sandra's leadership was functional and boring, exactly what it should be. They approved routine maintenance, enforced reasonable covenant standards, and avoided overreach into areas outside their authority. It was not exciting, but it was effective. I occasionally saw Brenda's probation officer at the county building when I went to pay property taxes or handle other administrative tasks. Once, I asked him how her probation was going. "She's complying with all requirements," he said. "Completed her community service, paying restitution on schedule, attending counseling sessions. She'll complete probation successfully if she stays on track." I nodded. I did not wish her harm. I just wanted her to understand that actions had consequences and that rules existed for good reasons. Whether she had actually learned those lessons or was just going through the motions to complete her sentence, I did not know. But at least She was no longer in a position to endanger the neighborhood. The second winter in the restored creek was even more beautiful than the first. The native plants I had installed were fully established now, and the bank was stable and healthy. Wildlife thrived. I saw herons fishing in the shallows, deer coming down to drink in early morning, and once even a beaver moving through, though it did not stay. In March, I got an email from Brenda. It was short and formal, clearly written with her attorney's input. Graham, I am writing to acknowledge that my actions regarding the creek modification were wrong and caused harm to you and other neighbors. I should have obtained proper permits and listened to concerns about safety. I take responsibility for the damage that resulted. I hope the neighborhood has recovered and that you are doing well. Brenda Whitmore. I stared at the email for a long time. It was not exactly a heartfelt apology. The language was legalistic and careful, but it was something. An acknowledgement of wrongdoing, an acceptance of responsibility. More than I had expected to ever receive. I wrote back. Brenda, I appreciate you reaching out. The neighborhood has recovered and the creek is healthy again. I hope you have learned from this experience and that things are going better for you. Graham. We did not correspond again. The message felt like closure, a final punctuation mark on a difficult chapter. Spring brought new growth along the creek banks. The columbines I had planted bloomed in shades of blue and purple. Wild irises added yellow accents. The water flowed clear and steady, following the path it had carved over thousands of years, unobstructed by human interference. I sat on my deck on a warm April evening, listening to the creek and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My laptop was inside, work completed for the day. A glass of wine sat on the small table beside my chair. Life was peaceful. The whole saga of Brenda's beach seemed distant now, like something that had happened to someone else. But I had learned important lessons. I learned that speaking up against wrongdoing was necessary, even when it was uncomfortable. I learned that community well-being sometimes required conflict. I learned that nature followed its own rules, and ignoring them led to disaster. Most importantly, I learned that home was not just a house, but a place where you felt safe and connected to the natural world around you. Riverside Heights was my home, and protecting the creek that flowed through it had been about more than just property rights or environmental regulation. It had been about preserving something beautiful and functional, something that belonged to all of us and none of us at the same time. The creek would flow long after I was gone. Future residents would sit on their decks and listen to it, just as I did. They would see herons and deer and beavers. They would plant flowers along the banks and let their kids throw sticks into the current. And hopefully, they would respect the water and understand that some things should be left alone, allowed to follow their natural course without human interference. Brenda Whitmore had wanted to control nature, to bend it to her vision of what her backyard should be. Nature had responded with indifferent, destructive force, washing away her beach and taking out her fence in the process. It was a lesson as old as humanity. Respect the natural world or face the consequences. I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to the creek, to the neighborhood, to the boring but essential work of county inspectors and prosecutors, and to the principle that some rules exist not to restrict us, but to protect us from our own worst impulses. The water burbled past, catching the last light of day, and I was grateful for every sound, every moment of peace, every ordinary evening in a neighborhood that had weathered its storm and come out stronger on the other side. The saga was over. The creek still flowed. Life went on as it always did, following the natural course that no amount of sandbags or human arrogance could permanently alter. That was the real ending. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just a return to the quiet normalcy that had been there all along, waiting to be restored. Sometimes that was the best outcome anyone could hope for. The creek knew it. Now I did too.